I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at panning options within Logic. Now then, once upon a time when everybody worked on consoles, hardware console mixing desks, the concept, the whole idea of having a pan dial to decide where a sound would come from within the stereo field was something that no one ever sort of overlooked. And it's fair to say that actually most of the way that we work within computers these days, it's really easy to forget that panning is an option. We are surrounded by these really wide, huge stereo sounds. And manufacturers of sample instruments are constantly trying to impress us with the volume and the range of their instruments. And of course, they don't want those instruments to be coming from one side or the other. They want us to hear them right down the middle of the stereo field every single time we fire up a new instrument. And it's kind of easy for mixes to get really conflated in the middle of a mix and to not make use of the fact that the stereo field is something we could really be engaging with to make our mixes more interesting. And in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a very simple little piece and we're going to see how powerful pan can be in the concept of making sure that all of the instruments within our track are coming from an appropriate place within the stereo field. And as a result of that, what I've done is to write a very simple little piece for a string ensemble so that we can actually hear each of the four instruments and where we want them to come from within the stereo field. So here's the track we're going to be working with. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to mute this piano part for a moment and we're just going to focus on the strings. And in particular, what I'm going to do is to focus on this first violin part. Now, if you were going to go to an orchestral concert and if you were to sit in the middle of the auditorium, what you would discover would be that the first violins would be on your left, the second violins would be nearer the middle, but also still slightly on the left, the violas would be to the right, and the cellos would be on the right-hand side and sort of further to the right, sort of opposite the first violins. Now at the moment, if I open up the mixer within this particular project, what I'm going to see is that there is no pan value that has been assigned to any of these sounds. So at the moment, they're all sort of greeting us from the middle of the stereo field. And there are two ways in which I can change that and do something about it. And the first is to use the direction mixer plugin. Now you can see that I've already set that up on this first track, the first violin track within this project. But if you want to know where it is, what I can do is to drop down here into this list and I'll find the direction mixer here in imaging. And if I select this option and open up this particular plugin, you can see what it looks like. And in particular, it gives me two main controls. Let's just solo the first violin part so we can hear it by itself. The first thing it's going to do is to give me control over the stereo spread of this sound. Now the sound that I'm using is a nicely recorded pizzicato first violin section, which has been recorded through some really nice mics and a really nice big stage. And particularly because there's a little bit of reverb on this sound is quite wide. At the moment, it's got a nice big stereo footprint. Now, if I want to narrow that so that I don't get this super stereo effect on all four stringed instruments, what I can do if I want to is just to narrow it a little bit before then deciding where in the stereo field I want to place it. So if you remember, I said that first violins traditionally would be a little bit off to the left-hand side of the stereo field. So that's what I've done with the direction mixer, as well as making the sound a little bit more narrow. Here's what the sounds like straight out of the box. And what I'll do is I'll punch in the direction mixer halfway through. Okay, so you can hear that that's really effective. Not only am I putting the first violins where I want them to be, they're also slightly smaller from a footprint point of view. Now what I could do would be to go through and put the direction mixer on all four of the stringed instruments, choose the direction that I want each to come from, and also set the stereo width for them. And that would be one way of doing it. The only problem with that approach is that when I open up the mixer, I can't see at a glance where I've placed those instruments. I'd rather do that with the pan dial. Now, you might be thinking, well, why not just do that in the first place then? Well, because it's not quite as straightforward as that. The regular pan dial within Logic is really a volume balance between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of any recorded sound. In other words, if I decide to take my first violin sample and just pan it to the left-hand side, actually all I'm hearing is whatever was on the left channel of the recording at that point that it was made. So if I pan hard left, effectively what I'm doing is dropping the volume of the right-hand channel of a stereo sample to 0. And similarly, if I pan all the way across to the right, I'm hearing on the right channel, but none of the left. What I actually want to do is to say I want all of the stereo sound, but what I want to be able to do is to fold it down to a particular point within the stereo stage, which allows me to fold both channels down to the area where I want that sound to be. And to do that, I need stereo pan rather than just balance. Now, the way that I can select that is by control clicking on the pan dial and switching from the balance dial to stereo pan. And you'll see that that has a different icon. What I'm now seeing is this kind of green bar all the way around the pan dial, showing me that at the moment, the sound is still pan in the middle and that I'm hearing the full stereo picture of that sound. So the first thing I'm going to do is just narrow this sound down a little bit by selecting the area where I want it to come from. And you can see that I've biased it over here to the left-hand side. And what I can actually do as well is to just make this even smaller if I want to, for a slightly narrower stereo width. So that's pretty much going back to what we were doing with the direction mixer a moment ago. So I've made it narrower and I've biased it to the part of the sound stage that I want to control. And what I'm now going to do is to make sure that stereo pan is selected for all the subsequent string parts. And what I can then do is to select the area where I want them to come from. So I'm going to make the first violin part a little bit narrower. The second violin part can sort of stay sort of a bit nearer the middle. I'm going to do the same thing with the violas, but to the right-hand side, and the cellos are going to be over here. So what we should now find is that across these 4 instruments, we get a much broader sense of stereo. So overall, the stereo picture has been increased, but what we've also got is a slightly more professional pan arrangement, separating those instruments out so that we've got something which is a bit closer to what normal would sound like if we go and sort of heard this arrangement actually in a hall. Let's have a listen. Okay, and what that also leaves is us the opportunity to have the piano continue to play sort of through the middle of the mix. The strings are kind of surrounding it with the piano coming through the middle. So within this video, what we've done is to look at 2 ways of making sure that the sounds that we're using aren't just simply by default occupying the entire stereo width that's available to us, every single sound taking up a very wide stereo picture. We started by looking at the direction mixer and using that to narrow stereo width and then choose a sort of pan position within the stereo field for each sound to go. And then what we've done is to remove the direction mixer and see how we can achieve a similar result using stereo pan.